Hi, everyone. I'm excited to have Rajesh Chandran as our guest this week. Rajesh is an immigrant, college dropout, and entrepreneur who has built deep tech machine learning companies in data-intensive domains like sales process analytics, which was acquired by LinkedIn, product market data analytics, acquired by NextTag, Providence Equity, and insurance analytics, acquired by Even Financial. His current interests include the application of machine learning techniques to manufacturing supply chain analytics and sustainable infrastructure building. Rajesh is the CEO and co-founder of Actual Systems, a sim city for real-world sustainable projects which address climate change, inequity, and other planetary challenges. Their modeling platform brings together stakeholders of large-scale infrastructure projects to collaborate, build understanding and intuition, and work quickly to build at the speed the world needs. So welcome, Rajesh. I am excited to have you here. I remember when we first met at Stanford, and we've
Right.
had a series of conversations since then. But tell everyone about Actual, because I think that when we met with you, when Mark and I met with you, we just lit up over what you were doing and seeing the peace tech potential of what you were endeavoring to do in terms of doing these sustainable projects in these built environments. And I have a passion for cities and urban planning, so it really lit me up.
Yeah, it's funny, ever since that conversation we had way back when, it feels like an eternity since we last met in person, but it's been a series of lessons we've learned where we were incrementally realizing that Mark and you were ahead of the curve in describing peace innovation, and we were sort of on the ground discovering what you already knew in some different ways. Initially, we hadn't really thought about Actual in terms of your thesis around peace innovation, but increasingly, as I've gotten to know your thesis and you as a team better, it feels very much well aligned. So the story of Actual, like a lot of stories around Silicon Valley startups, is we started in one place and then realized the real problem was way over here. So my co-founders are Karthik and Derek. They're both PhDs, one from Stanford. He's a literal rocket scientist out of Stanford. And the other, Derek, is a PhD from Yale and Oxford in cognitive science. And my background is, as you described, primarily in machine learning and data intensive applications. So when we got together, nearly 2.5 years ago, because we liked working with each other, we had worked together in prior endeavors before, we were looking at the intersection of our skill set, where we care deeply about data analytics as a practice and a craft, and we also cared about social consciousness and the idea that there is a force that's so powerful that we've been part of and we've been lucky enough to benefit from, that could be pointed in peace-oriented efforts. And so we started looking at infrastructure, and as unglamorous as that might be, bridges and roads and public transportation. And quickly we realized, given our backgrounds, that there's a significant gap between the way the future is being planned for and funded. And that's where we started. Like, we were thinking that the real problem was funding and getting kind of investors connected to the originators, and how telling those stories, connecting investors to motivate them to get, sustainable infrastructure, inequity addressed in these big cities and across the planet was the problem. But over time, what we realized is that actually it's a much smaller problem that actually needs to be addressed. And that's how we arrived at the SimCity idea. For those of you unfamiliar with the game SimCity, SimCity was an ancient game where you model toy cities you laid down zones and built housing and police. And if you didn't have enough police, there was crime went high. If you had no retail, you didn't have jobs, so people left the city. That kind of thing was being modeled. And it's a toy, but as a kid, it opened my eyes to kind of the dynamics of urban planning, right? As a practice. Whoa, there's so many things to consider. And what we drew inspiration from that system is that, what if this game that gives you such intuition for how cities and economies work could be brought to the real world, especially in sustainable technologies, in things that have positive economic impact, of course, but also social impact, as well as addressing climate change, for example, as a domain. So for example, our models help you model and justify investments in EV networks, electric vehicle charging. And we can show you how much consumption there is given the current number of electric vehicle trucks on the ground and projections about those numbers, and show you here's how many carbon credits you could get. And therefore it's a kicker in terms of getting you more revenue and more justifiable financial footprint. Oh, and by the way, California has all these incentives to remove carbon from the atmosphere. So here's another kicker. Oh, and by the way, the real users, so you can get raw revenue from implementing EV networks. That's just one example. But across the board, what we found is that there is a lack of truly intuition building around these new kinds of technologies. And that's where we are. We built a platform that should allow investors and originators rationalize these forward-looking projects in these spaces. Renewables, sustainable infrastructure is the future. How do you get money in a way that people can truly understand these models and not just look at a wall of numbers in Excel? Sorry, overlong introduction, but that's
no, that's great. It's funny. So and our thinking has evolved as well as we've been collaborating and thinking alongside with you. Because I know that for a long time, like smart cities were kind of a fad. Okay, we're going to have smart cities. And then you look at it and you go, but is that actually what people want? And had an opportunity to talk to the city manager for the city of Wellington in New Zealand. And he was at Stanford at the Digital Cities Conference a few years ago. And it was the usual tech bros coming up and saying, we're going to disintermediate this and that and the other. And I'd be like the annoying woman at the mic, because how these conferences are, they used to like, does anyone have any question? And I'd go like, I do. And I'd go like, okay, so once you've just totally disrupted this economy and you've got these, say, autonomous trucking vehicles and there's these ecosystems like in the Central Valley in terms of these small towns and so on. And once you've gotten rid of the drivers, then you've collapsed the local economy. What are you going to do with those people? And they go, well, Margarita, the Industrial Revolution came along and, we don't have buggy whips anymore and it was fine. And I'm going like, well, actually the Industrial Revolution didn't happen like that. And there was a lot of violence. It was not a good time, and certainly we've seen in the transition in the Midwest where it was a manufacturing and industrial powerhouse. And then literally 40 years later, 50 years later, it still hasn't recovered, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we have had 2 or 3 generations people born since, and it still hasn't recovered. So it's a non-trivial thing when you do that, you put these things in to see what the ripple effects are. So I'm fascinated like with SimCity and what you're doing. It's like, okay, how do we simulate that? How do we figure out how to do it in a way that serves everyone? But the city manager from Wellington said, he goes like, you know what? We surveyed our community and asked them what they wanted. And they said, we want more trees. We want more bike lanes. We want more, it was really about, I'm a mother and I got a stroller and I want places where I can push the stroller safely. None of them were saying, I want a solar powered asphalt street. It was like, I don't care about that. And so the trick is, how do we, all this amazing technology that is being developed, instead of us being in service of the technology, how do we get the technology to be in service of community and society? And when Johan Galtung talks about peace, he defined negative and positive peace, and negative peace being the absence of violence or fear of violence. And usually when people think about peace, it's like, oh, that's what we need to do. And instead, there's this whole domain of positive peace, which is where you're operating. And it's about the attitudes and the institutions and structures that create sustained peaceful societies. So, and we're talking about structures, sometimes we're talking literally about the structures, right? And how do you do that in a way that allows for collaborative and cooperative interactions among all the people in your sim city, right? Because we can create infrastructure that creates barriers. Redlining was a barrier. Langdon Winter writes about do artifacts have politics, right? Absolutely. Infrastructure can have politics. If you create roadways and overpasses where buses can't get through and poor people can't get into communities, that has a political agenda. So when you're working with actual and you're interacting with cities, are they thinking at kind of that meta level of Or are they just saying like, oh, what we need to do is, you know, we have Internet of Things everywhere and it's going to be great?
So that's a great thing. So let me just address two things. One is, again, like I said, your team and you have really sort of set the trail that we seem to be following, you know, and we've arrived at sort of independently, but now we are learning from you. This whole notion of positive peace has been baked into how we approach the company, right? And it comes on a couple of fronts, right? We value the role of technology for sure, right? We are technologists.
Sure.
I mean, but as you said, the unintended consequences and the blind forging ahead with technology has caused significant problems. So the way we look at this whole notion of positive peace is what we now jokingly refer to as the layer cake approach. And the idea is that if even very simple projects that seem innocuous, like we're going to put in water reclamation, right? Let's say, oh, it's great. Northern California has a drought problem. Water reclamation for irrigation is the right thing to do. However, when you think about the layers of problems, the deployment of water reclamation machinery needs power. Oh, you need cabling and piping, and oh, you need to have a system to make sure that the quality of the water is good enough for irrigation, but probably not good enough for you know, it's not potable water. So in those scenarios, what we try to do is we try to highlight, when you model those kinds of things on our platform, we try to highlight the deficiencies of a limited view. If you miss all the other layers of the cake, you're missing the big picture. So our approach has always been, even if you're doing something like water reclamation, remember, if you put in solar panels, you're likely to reduce the weight on the grid, the power grid. So there might be capital expenses up front, but in the long run, you're much more viable, you're much more sustainable, you have, you know, less impact on the environment around you. Oh, and by the way, if you line up purchasing in terms of farms around Northern California, you can probably have an environment where the community is behind you in doing water reclamation, and they don't see you as disruptive. The other aspect of it is, in terms of positive peace, we're also seeing a fairly important trend, and I'm sure you're seeing it too, where when we talk to not the originators of these projects, you know, the civil engineers, the general contractors, but the impact investors and the infrastructure investors, more and more, they are beholden to LPs, you know, limited partners, who are giving them the money to invest. And these limited partners are saying, we want you to tell us that the investments you make have these aspects. They're sustainable, they have positive social impact, they're not extractive of the communities that they're functioning in. So there's this both technological force where there are powerful technologies that can reduce your impact in terms of the ecology and the social impact, but also the deep pockets funding a lot of these are now saying, wait a second, I don't want to invest in regressive infrastructure. Tell me that, you know, you're going to be carbon negative even in some of these projects. And that's what we come in, right? We show them the layers of this cake and say, all these factors put together, including regulatory oversight, environmental impact, need to be considered when you bring in, like, let's say, a smart city project into your city, right? Because the consequences are actually fairly complicated, and developing intuition is paramount.
Yeah, and this is sort of, and this is happening. It's funny because this is has a trickle. None of this is in a textbook, right? And as you know, Mark and I are working on this whole peace engineering initiative with Drexel and University of New Mexico, and I have to name all the schools, Purdue and CU Boulder. Got to give them credit for being on the bleeding edge as we reimagine engineering curriculum, right? Because students who are graduating with engineering degrees aren't thinking about the intersectionality of engineering with these other issues. And we've actually, I'll have to show you the diagram, Raj. We have this great diagram that encapsulated what we mean by peace engineering or peace innovation, where there's peace engineering, there's peace finance, because you got to, whatever you engineer, you got to finance in some way, right? Exactly. If you're not thinking about the money, this isn't going to get built. And then the data, the peace data, which addresses the intersectionality, right? Because who is being touched, right? And you know, what's the X in the piece X? Is it, you know, which societies, which communities, which environments, which ecosystems, and understanding that. And that's not in the everyday vocabulary of engineers.
Yeah,
professional engineers, much less graduating engineers. We don't think that way yet, but we're on the bleeding edge of starting to develop programs and curriculum around that.
and
To get there, because it's a lot to, as you say, it's a lot to be aware of, and you go like, holy smokes, I could go to school all my life to to learn all this and
yeah,
figure this out, right? And you've
and
got people who have to get stuff done every day. So how do you simplify it so people can operationalize this and do it at scale? And it seems like that's what actual is really all about.
exactly, and just to address that particular problem you mentioned, because it is so important because of that mindset. Because I have a training as an engineer, and coming out of college, I would say I was blind to the impact of the choices I was making every day, right? In the sense that, in a way, the mindset required to be an engineer is all encompassing, right? You need to really focus in on the domain and understand what's going on, because things are fairly complicated in technology. But coming out of it, I would say I would fall in love with the technology or an idea and just pursue it, single-mindedly without any real thought for the consequences. And in a weird way, now that sort of over the last, 10 plus years of thinking about these problems, becoming slowly more and more aware of the impact has been alarming in a positive way. Let me put it that way. It just sort of woken me up to kind of the reality of what I do. But we run into that every day, by the way, right? Because a lot of the people we work with, our partners, are pure engineers, pure construction. And oftentimes, believe it or not, there's some stigma around this sort of social consciousness, positive impact message, because immediately that people are thinking, well, that's the purview of grants, or it's not a profitable commercially viable entity, right? And we have to kind of unwind that thinking in a lot of ways, where we go, look, above all, we are entrepreneurs. We're not in it to just put this much effort into a company and not have it be sustainable and freestanding. So a lot of the work we do is communicate the value of thinking this way financially, like the fiscal responsibility aspect, and then connecting that to their expertise. One anecdote, one of the presentations we did last year at Stanford, actually, and we actually presented a project of an originator in Northern California who is a civil engineer, one of the best civil engineers apparently by reputation, and that's part of the reason why we're working with them. Yeah. And we presented their project on our platform, right? And at the end of it, it was very funny because he came up to me and said, seeing you guys tell the narrative in an intuitive way inspired me about my own project.
Yeah.
Because what you don't get training when you're in civil engineering and other hard engineering practices is, how do you tell the story? How do you think about the broader impact, right? There is usually no narrative other than the nuts and bolts of engineering, right? It's sort of a boxed in domain. And I think that's part of our purpose, right? Beyond sort of the technical acumen of our team, we are trying very hard to help people tell their stories in a compelling way that is multidimensional, so that they can connect better with their investors, have a better chance of coming to, these projects have a better chance of coming to fruition. One thing you mentioned, redlining, right? I think the other thing about seeing the sea change among investors around not just seeing the fiscal impact, but also the social impact and ecological impact, is that the inequity in some of the choices made, historical choices made, is particularly on my mind and our team's mind, at Actual. And we are working very hard to make sure our models don't fall into the world where it is just follow on things that are already working or things that are considered already working. We are trying to, as much as I hate to use the word, disrupt some of that thinking around stale kind of, this is the way we've done it for 50 years, and we're going to continue to do it this way. Right. In fact, we just published an article about redlining on our site. I'll forward that to you as well.
Okay, we'll put it in the show notes. Yeah.
Oh, that'd be great. Yeah. We care deeply, and we're taking some concrete steps not to have that blind spot. And I think, unfortunately, it has to be active. I don't think it's going to come naturally. I think we have to kind of actively take a position where we're considering these sort of side effects, negative and positive, of the kinds of projects we take on.
Yeah, there's I know that within the Institute and certainly with our 6-month co-op students, one of the themes that we've had with them is thinking about colonial and post-colonial, colonial and post-colonial thinking.
Yeah.
And one of our PIN bootcamp entrepreneurs is actually schooled in post-colonial theory, and she's applying our methods to create some peace tech solutions in West Africa. And I love talking to her because I'm going like, oh my God, yes, thank you. You're actually schooled and expert in post-colonial thinking and theory. And the dilemma that we have in the West, and especially in the United States, in our culture, is that we're not even aware of the colonial mindset because it's so deep inside. It's like the old thing about fish don't know about water, right? Um, and so it just gets passed down. It's just this implicit bias, and it's this paradigm of how the world operates. So we don't even think to question it because we don't know that there's an alternative. And what I've really appreciated is our opportunity to work with people around the world who who are outside of the Western Judeo-Christian mindset and heritage, and they go like, well, actually there's a different way to think about the future, right? There's a different way to think about these things. And it's been wonderful to sort of step out and go, because I'm beginning to see the shadow of colonialism all around me now. And of course it's been, a little bit in because of Black Lives Matter, thinking about all this. But when I was doing social entrepreneurship, it was always a head scratcher to me why there were food deserts. Why is it that in East Palo Alto, they did not have a grocery store for 30, 40 years? I go, people buy groceries. There's like, I don't know how many 5,000 households there. That should be enough to sustain a grocery store, don't you think? So it can't be that it's not financially possible to have a grocery store there because there are customers. I mean, they eat food every day. So what gives? Or any kind of desert in these underserved communities, and you realize it's the legacy of redlining. It's the legacy of signaling that these areas are not investable, right? Which is simply a limiting story in everyone's head. It's this narrative that people have that doesn't necessarily fit with the facts.
Yeah.
Right.
So,
if you just looked at the data and say, here's a community, this is the number of households, they eat every day, you go, boom, I'm going to put a grocery store there. It's just like,
yeah,
it's a no-brainer.
it's funny, right? I mean, it's, as I said, that stigma still pursues us to this day, in the sense that oftentimes the first time I meet a potential partner, I have to be ready for that bombardment of, is this an investable thing? Is it, or is it more, again, as I said earlier, in the purview of grants and, charitable organizations? And I think there's a place for that. But for example, one of our first projects, we haven't really broadly announced this, but it is not hidden either. One of our very early projects that is still ongoing is rationalizing bringing broadband to all of Kenya. And so the reason it hasn't been done before at scale is because, again, for this point, like superficially, the common sort of belief is that, oh, there's not a market there for significant broadband investment. But what we show with our models is that, in fact, the population of Kenya is remarkably young, right? Like 70% of the population is like below, I think, 45 years of age. And the demand for network and commercial activity that follows both from private sector and public sector, schooling and governmental organizations, is so high that it's actually very commercially viable. So we're working with a couple of international entities like SoftBank, the World Bank, and UNICEF. We built a model of using our tools and showed them it's actually viable, right? And it's worth putting in the billions of dollars necessary to invest in these kinds of networks. And again, the battle there is, again, I hate to say this, but a little bit of lack of imagination, and maybe we're trying to sort of open the aperture a little bit on kind of the possibilities, and we're not trying to. It's not smoke and mirrors, right? It's hard science, hard sort of economic models around what the demand looks like. As you said, in the case of East Palo Alto, it was always shocking to me when I first moved to Palo Alto that right across the 101, it's a different country, right? And the fact that there's a blind spot like that in my mind was just alarming, and I think it's going to take a while for us, collectively change the mindset. But I think, we hope that we're a small step in the right direction with people like you.
I was talking to someone yesterday who does really novel infrastructure investment in New York City. Um, and he was talking about, he said, like, when you look at investment, and certainly, interest rates in the market are so low. So when you're looking at the returns that you can get in terms of public markets, they're just really, really low. And especially when pension funds and so on are looking, it's, what is a projected rate of return, and how do they allocate their assets. He said a lot of that math was done back in the 70s when interest rates were much higher. And
Yep.
it hasn't really been updated, right? It's like, yeah, sure, 5, 7%. Today it's like 3, right? And so he says, when you're looking at the developed world, it's sort of like the law of large numbers. To get any kind of growth is wickedly difficult. He says, but if you go into countries in Africa, if you go into the developing world, small, young, your return on investment can be very high because they're
Exactly.
growing so fast, right?
Exactly.
And so if you're looking for an ROI, go look there. But he said it's the lack of imagination and this blocker that nothing's really going on there. The story on the developing world has been written. It's a backwater, it's a mess, forget about it. It's, poor kids with flies in their eyes, right?
Yeah.
And he said, but if you actually look at the reality of what's going on, it's dynamic, they're growing, they're young, you know, uh, Japan, Germany, Italy, severely aging population, certainly in the United States, our demographic, you know, if you want to see the growth, it's going to be young people of color
Yeah.
and old white people. I mean, it's just like, that's kind of what it is. So, but he was talking about also elite projection. So especially coming out of Silicon Valley, there's a lot of projection of what elites think how the world operates without really having any connection to how the rest of the world operates.
Yeah, and I
And
think that's
that elite projection blinds you to the opportunities that are out there and the potential that's out there because you think it has to all come from you. So you get into that like Silicon Valley savior complex,
yeah,
right?
and it's self-fulfilling too, right? Because we have so much influence on where the money directs itself from being in Silicon Valley. It's self-fulfilling in that once you get into that mindset, you're going to do things that indirectly make that reality, right? The investments are not going to be there because you believe that there are no investments going to be there, right? And
Right.
what is which is another reason why I love the work you guys are doing with, I think we were working together on the narrative projects, because one key thing to unlock a little bit of that kind of tunnel vision is, can we create a narrative at first to kind of introduce people to this different way of thinking about these kinds of projects, where traditionally, as you said, there's a mindset that's hard to get unstuck in people's minds collectively, to start thinking more expansively, more imaginatively about what's possible. And again, honestly, the Kenya project I mentioned, while the outcomes were delightful, I was actually initially not exactly sure that we could justify, right?
Mm-hmm.
Justify huge investments, in the billions of dollars, right? But hard data combined with sort of the overall narrative around where these communities, like you said, these young populations are creating such economic activity, and they're growing so fast that if you want real ROI, you don't put it into a reinsurer, or you don't put it into a reinsurer, or a juicer for that matter. Yes.
Right.
And
I mean, God knows that in Silicon Valley we throw all sorts of money away, on where you go, really? How much for this juicer? Really? How much for this thing? And people go like, a couple, 10, 15, 20, 40 million into this. It's like,
yeah,
talking
I think,
about like, suspension of disbelief. It's like, wow, talking about buying into a narrative.
yeah, it's the other pretty amazing thing I've seen, and maybe this is maybe I'm being Pollyannish, and I'm coming from a place of optimism because I love what we're building at Actual. But one other concrete thing I've seen pretty consistently is, even this morning before this call, I was doing a demo for a big sort of network related company and networking related company, and because they're trying to figure out how to get justify like large investments in new infrastructure to bring internet to new places, right? And my demo was literally just give me 10 minutes and let me show you the population demand. Let me show you what a clear articulation of the demand and the value of the commercial value first of these new undiscovered countries look like, right? And what if you could tell the story to your investors, right? And that's what hooks people, right? The fact that it's not that there's direct, explicit ill intent. It's more like they haven't had the discussion around wait, are we thinking about these kinds of investments and what investability looks like in the right way? And as you said, a lot of it's narrative, right? The suspension of disbelief comes from the narrative that we are captains of industry. Therefore, whatever we do must have some incredible value in Silicon Valley. And then some of the investments you're talking about, that's why money flows in, because there's some belief that we must be investing and doing the right things because we are here, right? And so, but that's been eye-opening in the sense that what little we can do in telling that story, and the frameworks that you're creating, I think, are going to be so important in just beginning those conversations, right, and changing the mindset, combined with the hard facts and hard numbers and hard models, of course.
Absolutely.
But it starts with the story and the narrative.
Yeah, and Lee Slotoff is a good friend of Mark Nelson and I, and Lee is he's a creator of MacGyver. So he says, MacGyver was the first peace engineer. So we met him a number of years. Yeah, no guns, exactly. It's like, oh, I have to solve this conflict without using weapons. And so part of the MacGyver ethos is you take what you have and turn it into what you need, right? And so MacGyver is very creative and very resourceful and very innovative. And it's been on the air for the last 30 years in 79 countries. And
I was 8 years old in Bahrain in the Middle East when I saw my first MacGyver episode. So it's everywhere.
Yeah.
I love MacGyver so much. When I was a kid, it was awesome.
Right. And he said that Lee thought that part of MacGyver's appeal was the fact that he didn't use weapons. And especially in those markets where it was shown, where people could relate to it and say, yeah, we have to be super resourceful and take, what we have and transform it into what we need. We MacGyver all day long, right? And so just having that character, that iconic character, just sort of validated their own creativity and ingenuity.
It's interesting. I think I can completely relate to the lack of resources narrative on several fronts, right? I think given my background, the types of companies I'm most equipped to build tend to be fairly technology intensive, and at the beginning of these companies, I rarely have massive resources, and a lot of what we do is tend to do is like putting together ad hoc solutions and see if they stick, as quickly as possible with a 2 or 3 person team, and we generally compete against the juggernauts of American capitalism. So we always have to find some lateral thinking way to get into these markets, and I think it's interesting. That's part of the formula, I think, that will go far in changing the mindset you're talking about, because I think a certain cohort will need some concrete initial proof, in the small, right, before they will sort of take on more risk at a large scale. So I think what are your thoughts on sort of kind of the elements of proof necessary, right? I mean, I know you're working with so many of these entrepreneurs across the planet, right?
Yeah.
And bootstrapping is such such a painful, difficult.
It is. Well, it's interesting. So I've been reflecting on this again as I think back on my career, and I was saying to Mark, where have I had my greatest successes? And the times that I had my greatest successes were when I felt fearless, right? When it was really clear in my mind what I needed to do, and I just did it. I didn't go around asking for permission. I didn't go around fundraising. I didn't do all the things that you're supposed to do. I didn't put together a pitch deck. I didn't, the times that I've done that, I have failed, honestly. But when I just say, it's almost like, okay, not to get too woo, but when I just manifest it, I go, this thing just needs to exist. And I'm going to do it through sheer force of will. I tell my son that I manifested him. I go, I just decided you needed to be born. It's like, there you are. Athena out of Zeus's head. It's like, voila, I made a baby. It felt that way. But early in my career, my first serious job was through a temp agency, Manpower, back in the day. I just needed a job, and I'd be like, okay, walking down University Avenue in Palo Alto. I walk in, say, can you take a typing test? I go, sure, 85 words a minute. They go, great. Here, go work over there. I get on my 10-speed bicycle. I ride over. I was filling in for an executive assistant. I was an engineering undergrad. I'm going like, whatever, yeah, minding my own business, typing on IBM Selectric. And these guys are trying to do something, and I just poke over and I go, oh, it looks like, oh, computer-aided design, yeah, huh. You might want to network those things. And this is like in 1983. All right, so this is like when 3Com is just getting off the ground. But the thing is that I hung out with a bunch of people in the mornings for coffee, and so this was part of my social group, my milieu. And so I was hanging out with people who were doing AI research at Stanford and all these tech guys, right? And so I go, oh,
fun.
It was incredibly fun, but I was like, a PYT. I was a very young woman at the time. And so these older guys was like, yeah, come and have coffee with us, Margarita. And I just listened to them. And I just soaked it up like a sponge, right? It was just, I didn't quite like, oh, that's how you do. So in my head, I was getting schooled over coffee every morning. And so I walk into this organization and I go, oh, okay. So I start designing this local area network because someone said, oh, you need to go to Xerox and you need to get their blue book. And I go, there's a blue book? Oh, okay. I'll go get the, I was like, oh, okay. So I go over to it and I go to the lobby and go, hi, I need to get a blue book. And the blue book was really, it looked like those little booklets that you make from 8.5 by 11 paper, and you fold it in half and you staple it, and it's got a blue cover. That was the blue book. I wish I still had it. And the blue book told you how to design a local area network. So you get this thick coax cable and this thin coax cable, and you go, all right, you thick, thin, you get the backbone, and I go, all right, and so I go back to, and I go, all right, I got the plan. This is how we're going to design this local area network. And I had the largest local area network within a year. And so they went from typewriters to computers, from drafting tables to computer-aided design systems on compact 386 computers, 13-inch screen. Wow. And we threw out, I was just like, it was like this generational change in technology like that. Because I go like, oh yeah, all right, I got it. I got it figured out. And these guys were kind of like, how do we do this? How do we do this? And I'm going like, done, next, But it was that fearless, I can figure it out, we can do it, and transform an organization, right? And then I did that again when I was in venture, then I did that again when I was doing the technology incubator. So for me, it's like just having a really strong vision and just, it's like, it's more important to do than to explain. Because if you spend a lot of time explaining, and you haven't done it, as a woman of color, no one's going to take my word for it. I can't spin the bullshit. I can't say, well, I'm going to have this high-tech juicer and people are going to pay $450. I can't sell anyone on that. It just doesn't work. Can't do it. Where it works for me is when I actually pull it off. I say, look, we just did it. Nobody was looking and paying attention. That's how we did Maynard Labs, Dustin Heisler and I. 20-minute phone calls like, hey, let's do that. Sure. And he calls like, okay, I got the domain. Cool. Okay, I got a web page up. Cool. What are we doing now? Well, we're just declaring this. poof. And the next thing you knew, Maynard, Texas was like this hub of GovTech, just like that, because we made it so. We just put a stake in the ground, said, we're doing this, put our shingle out, voila. So for new things, I just find that, and then I have the story to tell. And again, all these things weren't super elaborate because you just have to make this tiny thing, and then and what catches people off guard is you go, well, everyone else was debating and planning and doing the desk research and reading article after article after article of like if they're going to ever do it. You just actually went and built some tiny thing. They're going like, really? Because Maynard, Texas was population 5,000 people, and we became like this like leading edge gov tech incubator that was mentioned in the same sentence as New York City, Boston, and San Francisco.
That's awesome.
So at least for me, that's what's worked. Because the pioneer marketing is really hard. It's just wickedly hard, as you know.
Yeah,